On March 14, 2011, 3 days after the earthquake, a memo arrived at a TEPCO press conference. A company official rushed across the room to the vice president. He handed him the note. The note said, "The Prime Minister's office has banned the word." The word was meltdown. 3 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant had already melted down. TEPCO's own engineers knew it. Their computer simulations confirmed it. The evidence was visible on live television: the explosions, the steam, the destroyed reactor buildings that could only mean one thing. For 2 months, TEPCO told the public it was core damage. For 2 months, the Japanese government used the same language. For 2 months, the people living near Fukushima, people deciding whether to evacuate, whether to stay, whether to let their children play outside, made those decisions without knowing that the word that described their situation had been officially removed from the vocabulary of the people who knew. In 2016, TEPCO's own president admitted it. "I would say it was a cover-up," he said. "It's extremely regrettable." The word cover-up came from the company's own president. 5 years after the meltdowns. This is the story of what Japan's government and TEPCO knew, when they knew it, and what they chose to say instead. At 2:46 p.m. on March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the Pacific coast of Japan. It was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan and the 4th most powerful in recorded history. The earthquake generated a tsunami, a series of waves that struck the northeastern coast of Japan approximately 30 to 40 minutes after the initial quake, with wave heights reaching up to 40 meters in some locations. The tsunami killed approximately 19,500 people. It destroyed coastal communities across the Tohoku region. It swept away buildings, vehicles, fishing fleets, and the ordinary infrastructure of the towns and cities that had developed along one of Japan's most productive coastlines over centuries. And it struck the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. The plant had 6 reactors. When the earthquake hit, 3 of them, units 1, 2, and 3, were operating. The earthquake triggered an automatic shutdown of the reactors, as designed. Backup diesel generators activated to power the cooling systems that prevent the shutdown reactors from overheating. The tsunami arrived 40 minutes later. The wave heights at Fukushima Daiichi exceeded the plant seawall by several meters. The tsunami flooded the generator rooms. The backup diesel generators failed. Without power, the cooling systems that were preventing the shutdown reactors from overheating stopped working. In a nuclear reactor, a loss of cooling is not a stable situation. The reactor cores, which remain intensely radioactive even after shutdown, continue to generate heat. Without cooling, the fuel rods heat beyond their design limits. The zirconium cladding that contains the nuclear fuel begins to react with steam, generating hydrogen. If the hydrogen accumulates and ignites, the result is the kind of explosion that the world watched on live television on March 12 and 14 and 15. By March 12, TEPCO engineers had assessed the situation in Reactor 1. They knew what was happening. The fuel had melted. The word for this is meltdown. While TEPCO and the Japanese government managed their language, approximately 154,000 people were being evacuated from the area around the Fukushima plant. They were told to leave a 20-kilometer exclusion zone, then a 30-kilometer zone. The zones were established based on official assessments of the radiation risk, assessments that were being made, simultaneously, by officials who were using the phrase core damage rather than meltdown in their public communications. The people being evacuated were making decisions about how far to go, about whether to return, about whether it was safe to eat local produce, about whether to let their children go outside, on the basis of information that was being managed to prevent the word meltdown from appearing. Some evacuees stayed close, believing the situation was less severe than it was. Some were exposed to radiation levels that, had the full picture been communicated accurately, they might have chosen to avoid. The gap between what was known and what was said had consequences for real people making real decisions in real time. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. The decision to ban the word meltdown was not the only information management decision made in the days and weeks following March 11, 2011. It was the most consequential single decision. It was not made in isolation. TEPCO's public communications in the days after the disaster described reactor conditions using language specifically chosen to minimize apparent severity. Core damage rather than meltdown. Elevated radiation levels rather than specific measurements that would have communicated the actual scale of the release. Statements that acknowledged problems while consistently describing them as less severe than the company's own internal assessments indicated. The Japanese government's communications followed a parallel pattern. Officials from the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, the regulatory body responsible for nuclear oversight, provided public briefings that used the same minimizing language. The Prime Minister's office, according to the 2016 investigation, was the source of the pressure that produced the meltdown ban. The cover-up extended beyond language. The SPEEDI system, the System for Prediction of Environmental Emergency Dose Information, a government-operated computer system designed specifically to predict the spread of radiation in a nuclear emergency, was running continuously from the first hours of the crisis. Its predictions showed the direction and extent of the radioactive plume spreading from Fukushima. The SPEEDI data was not released to the public. It was not released to the evacuees trying to determine which direction to flee. It was released to the United States military, whose personnel were in Japan following the earthquake as part of Operation Tomodachi, the U.S. military's disaster relief operation, allowing American service members to make informed decisions about radiation exposure that Japanese citizens were not permitted to make. The SPEEDI data was eventually released publicly in late March 2011, after the critical window for evacuation decision-making had already passed. The radiation dosimeter fraud added a third layer. In December 2011, workers at the Fukushima plant were found to have been instructed by a subcontractor executive to cover their radiation detection devices with lead shields. The lead would absorb radiation, causing the dosimeters to record lower exposures than the workers were actually receiving, allowing them to continue working in high radiation areas beyond the legal exposure limits. 9 workers followed the instruction. They were unknowingly exposed to more radiation than the law permitted. The people responsible for instructing them to cover the detectors had decided that the work schedule was more important than the workers' legal radiation exposure limits. The Fukushima cover-up is not, at its core, a story about nuclear energy. It is a story about what institutions do when the truth is inconvenient. TEPCO in 2011 was a company facing the worst crisis in its history, a crisis that would ultimately cost hundreds of billions of dollars in cleanup costs, destroy the company's financial viability, and end Japan's nuclear energy expansion plans for at least a decade. The incentive to minimize the apparent severity of the situation was immense. The Japanese government in 2011 was managing a compound disaster, an earthquake, a tsunami, and a nuclear crisis simultaneously, with a public that was already in shock. The incentive to maintain calm by avoiding the most alarming language was real, even if the consequences of avoiding it were worse than the alarm itself. Neither incentive justified what was done. The people making decisions about whether to evacuate, how far to go, whether it was safe to stay, they needed accurate information. They were not given it. The gap between what institutions knew and what they said cost people health, homes, and in some cases, lives. That gap had a name, in 2016, when TEPCO's own president gave it one. He called it a cover-up. The immediate consequences of the Fukushima disaster for the surrounding communities were severe and lasting. Approximately 154,000 people were evacuated from the exclusion zones established around the plant. Some returned in subsequent years as zones were gradually lifted. Many did not, and many never will, because the homes they left are in areas where radiation levels remain above the thresholds that would permit comfortable long-term habitation. The evacuation itself caused deaths. The disruption of evacuation, the stress, the displacement, the disruption of medical care and ordinary social support, produced an estimated 2,000 to 2,200 evacuation-related deaths among the elderly and sick who were uprooted from their communities. This figure exceeds the number of deaths directly attributable to radiation exposure from the disaster. More people died from being evacuated than from the radiation they were evacuated to avoid. The specific irony of that A cover-up designed to prevent panic, contributing to a decision-making environment in which evacuation zones may have been larger or managed differently than they would have been with better information, has been examined by researchers who have produced findings that are contested and that the full complexity of the disaster makes difficult to resolve cleanly. What is not contested is that the information available to the people making evacuation decisions was incomplete in ways that TEPCO and the Japanese government chose. In 2016, TEPCO's investigation and its president's statement produced the admission that had been 5 years coming. The word cover-up entered the official record. The apology was expressed. No criminal charges for the cover-up itself were sustained. 3 TEPCO executives were tried for professional negligence, not for the information management but for the failure to take adequate precautions before the disaster. They were acquitted in 2019. The acquittal was overturned on appeal in 2023, and the case returned for retrial. In August 2023, Japan began releasing treated radioactive water from the Fukushima plant into the Pacific Ocean, a process expected to continue for decades. The release was approved by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which found the treated water's radiation levels to be within safe parameters. China banned Japanese seafood imports in response. South Korea's government supported the release while its public protested it. The debate about the water release reopened the broader debate about Fukushima's legacy, about what had been learned, what had been admitted, and what remained unresolved. The cover-up had been named. The consequences had not been fully accounted for. The word meltdown was banned on March 14, 2011. It returned to official use in May 2011, 2 months later, when TEPCO formally acknowledged what its engineers had known since the first week. In the 2 months between the banning and the acknowledgement, approximately 154,000 people made decisions about their lives, where to go, how far, whether to return, with information that had been specifically managed to exclude the most accurate description of what was happening. Some of those decisions produced outcomes that would not have been the same with better information. The people who made the wrong decisions, who stayed too close because the official language suggested they could, who were exposed to levels of radiation they might have avoided with a more accurate picture, did not have the benefit of knowing what TEPCO's engineers knew in the first days of the crisis. They had what was given to them. What was given to them was managed. TEPCO's president said so himself, in 2016, 5 years after the fact. The exclusion zones around Fukushima still exist, in reduced form. Some will exist until the 2040s or beyond. The cleanup of the plant itself, the decommissioning of the damaged reactors and the management of the nuclear material within them, is one of the most complex engineering projects in human history. It is expected to take 40 years. The people who were evacuated from the communities closest to the plant have been told they can return to some areas. Many have not returned. The communities that existed before March 11, 2011, have not reconstituted themselves. The word meltdown was banned for 2 months. The consequences are not measured in months. They are measured in decades. They are still being measured.